We have 3 speakers. That means, and we have 2 hours. That means each speaker would have 40 minutes, including discussion. And the discussion is important for us. So I would say it should be ideally 25 minutes of presentation. I will notify you after 20 or 22 minutes. And then after 30 minutes, I'll become authoritarian and I will stop you because we want to have some time for discussion. The papers will be held in the order as it is announced in the program so that people who want to come in later for a special presenter or want to leave for another presenter can do so. And we will hear the 3 papers and discuss each for itself. And I also introduce the 3 presenters, each for himself. The first one is Wilhelm Guggenberger, a colleague of mine from the University of Innsbruck. He's a professor for Catholic social teaching and social ethics. He, at the time, is also the dean of our theological faculty. And one of his central interests is the problem of sustainability, the social development goal number 16 of the UNO. But today, he talks about moments of grace in a field of ruins. I think a very promising title. I'm very happy that you give this paper, Willy. And we all should talk in this microphone because, or that microphone, because it's being recorded.
So until now, I'm not able to handle my presentation, so I don't think if this will work. Would be good. Es posible mantener
picture the results of what's been years deserved in if I were that there's admitted to I when I look but when he said that and then look that start so you said next.
Okay, then I will do it this way. So, so let's start. You can leave this. So thank you for attending this concurrent session. I was decided, according to the topic of my presentation for this conference at the moment when I recognized that these 2 people, Alejandro González Iñárritu and Guillermo Arriaga, alumni of the Universidad Iberoamericana, the university which is hosting us here. The 2 made 3 quite successful motion pictures together. Arriaga as scriptwriter and Iñárritu as director. And I suppose that Iñárritu is better known for his 2015 movie, The Revenant. But I'm going to talk about the last film of the 3 made together with Arriaga, titled Babel. Babel was released in 2006, and even if that's an advanced age for a Hollywood movie, I think this film is well worth seeing, and its message is very topical. And more than this, I think it fits perfectly with the theme of this conference and lends itself well to an analysis guided by mimetic theory. Next. As the title suggests, the movie tells a story about the painful limitations of communication. Language is one of the characteristics of being human. It is the basis of culture. Also, the diversity of languages and thus of cultures, of what Babel stands for in cultural history, represents an enormous wealth, but at the same time a constant source of misunderstanding, conflict, and suffering. Next. The film Babel shows the pitfalls on language, but goes further. It's a multi-narrative drama telling at least 3 different plots situated in 3 different countries. Also in 3 different cultural settings. By the way, this general structure of entangled different stories is characteristic of Arriaga's scripts. 2 different languages are spoken at each of the locations we are taking to as viewers, English and Arab, respectively Berber language in Morocco, English and Spanish around the US-American border, and Japanese and sign language in Tokyo. We feel intensely how language and the representations languages are generating are rather dividing people from each other than connecting them, even if they are entangled in the same fate. Actually, human interaction seems to be a hopelessly lost field of ruined relationships for the most part. But this movie is more than a defeatist scenario of loneliness and failure. Just as the biblical story of the Tower of Babel stands at the beginning of a story of promise, the film Babel also opens up perspectives of hope and grace. As it was stated by Thomas Riegler, an Austrian scholar reflecting Arriaga's scripts, his narrations, quote, are insightful meditations on the healing powers of love, forgiveness, and redemption, although Arriaga's scripts display very graphically the cruelty humans are capable of, they display an even stronger belief in humanity. So I do not expect that all of you know this film. Has somebody seen it? Has somebody? Okay, you know it. The more it's necessary to give at least a little introduction into the plot. So next, please. Okay, it's okay. So
It's okay.
We start at the left side. A Moroccan goat breeder buys a gun from his neighbor with the intention of protecting his herd from jackals. The two sons of the farmer have a competition out of both rivalry and boredom. Who's the better with the rifle? First, they shoot at boulders, then at distant cars, a fatal folly. The salesman had said you can hit the target from miles away. They do not really believe, but suddenly the fun turns serious. One of the two, Youssef, seems to have actually hit a coach. On the bus, there is an American tour group, among them Susan, Kate Blanchett, and Richard, Brad Pitt, a couple trying to overcome a profound crisis of their relationship on this trip to Africa. We finally learn that their youngest child has died on sudden infant death syndrome. Their communication is full of mutual reproaches because of that. Now Susan is hit by a bullet out of the blue and hurt seriously. Nobody knows what's going on. Threat scenarios immediately spread. Was it a terrorist attack? Are the Americans surrounded by enemies in the middle of an Islamic country? When Richard finally reaches the US embassy by phone, a diplomatic crisis is brewing between the United States and Morocco. In the meantime, Richard fights for his wife's life. As no hospital is accessible in the remote desert region, the Moroccan travel companion takes them to his home village, where a vet provides Susan with makeshift care. A somewhat sinister-looking Berber woman sits beside. She doesn't speak any word, but cares for Susan too. So even if there is no enmity at all, the couple is left behind by the tour group in the poor village, as the other travelers are too afraid of possible threats. The movie doesn't tell this story unbroken and in one strand. We are repeatedly torn from the scene and taken to two other locations. One of them is San Diego. The two small children of Susan and Richard being cared there by the Mexican nanny Amelia, played by Adriana Bazara. Due to the dramatic events in Morocco, the parents' journey home is delayed. But Amalia has a family of her own. Her son is going to marry not far away in a Mexican village. Amalia really loves Susan's children, but wants to be present at her own child's wedding. And as she can't find another solution, she decides to take them with her to Mexico just for one day, a fatal decision. Leaving the US is easy. After the lovely party, Amelia's nephew is supported to take her and the children home in his car late in the night. When problems arise at the border crossing, he loses his nerve and races into the desert, pursued by police. He drops Amelia and the children off somewhere in the desert to pick them up again later, but we guess the trip will end in disaster. The nephew does not return, and the next day the three of them are left exhausted, disoriented, and without any water in the desert. When Amelia goes for help, she also loses the children. Eventually, they are rescued, but Amelia is deported, loses everything she has built up in the US, as she did live and work there illegally. She is treated like an outlaw and not even allowed to know how the children are doing. That's none of the business of an irresponsible woman like her. The third storyline leaves us as viewers baffled for a long time. What does the story of a Japanese teenager have to do with what has been told so far? Chieko is a deaf-mute girl living in Tokyo with her father, as her mother is already gone. The relationship between father and daughter seems to be strained, and Chieko also gets into conflicts outside the family. With crude sexual advances, she tries to establish the contact with others that her disability makes difficult for her. She tries to kiss her dentist, for example, and makes erotic advances to him, whereupon he throws her out of her surgery, presumably to protect her as well as himself. It takes some time before we learn that Chieko's father went on a safari in Morocco years ago and gave his rifle to his guide at the end of the trip as a present. The guide was the very man who has sold his rifle to his neighbor. Here, the circle closes. For the shepherd boys, Yusuf and Ahmad, their ill-considered competition ends in tragedy. The Moroccan police show no mercy and pursue the two with full force, shooting them and their father as they try to hide somewhere in the desert. Once again, it's Yusuf who grabs the gun and returns fire. When he realizes that his brother has been hit by police bullets, the boy smashes the rifle that caused all the trouble and turns himself in with his hands up, signaling everything is his fault alone. Is it all the fault of a minor shepherd boy? Is it all the fault of an American Winchester rifle? Is it all the fault of a Japanese hunter who gave this rifle away, or of the recipient who sold it on to buy necessities? Next. Read with theological eyes, the movie Babel is a parable about entanglements in a network of guilt. One could say it's a tale about the pitfalls of original sin. I'm aware that this is only one possible reading of the story, but from the first time I saw the film, I was struck by the idea that we are confronted here with a global community of faith in which smallest mistakes and offenses lead to tragedies for which no one is really responsible, but to which everyone has somehow contributed. Nobody intended the dramatic results, but the structural circumstances push the agents into a dead end of catastrophe. In his encyclical letter, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, Pope John Paul II, using the term of liberation theology, wrote about structures of sin. These are larger than individual agents are and therefore seem to be overwhelming and unchangeable. Yet they are, quote, rooted in personal sin and thus always linked to the concrete acts of individuals, unquote. The individual acts are coined by structures and are at the same time producing new structural obstacles for positive interaction. Thus, we are trapped in a vicious cycle. Representations are part of such destructive structures of a complex world. Like structures of sin, representations are entrenched forms of misunderstanding and misinterpretation of reality, and thus prevent real encounter and understanding between people. Girard's approach may help us better understand this vicious cycle. However, it is often overlooked that Girard also gives indications of what has the capacity to break this cycle. Iñárritu and Arriaga's film also contains such hints. I would like to call them moments of grace that can easily be overlooked in the drama of the overall composition. However, they constitute a decisive strength of this cinematic narrative. Next. The script of Babel doesn't really commit itself to where the sources of all the evil lies. One misfortune causes another. But it is probably no coincidence that the story begins in an almost biblical scene in which two brothers rival for their father's approval. Arriaga has a sense for mimetic rivalry, probably also for scapegoating structures, as it's shown by his 1994 novel Un dulce olor a muerte, which depicts a scapegoating in a Mexican village. This intuition may stem less from theoretical reflections than from his own experience. It could be mentioned here that Iñárritu and Arriaga were involved in fierce rivalry conflict with each other from the beginning of their collaboration. After Babel, their relationship finally broke. Next. However, I announced to talk about the hopeful moments of the story. Two scenes are particularly noteworthy in that context. Both are characterized by an intense, albeit quiet, emotional density. So let's return to the Moroccan village. Susan is lying on the bare floor of a hut, provisionally bandaged, but still in mortal danger. Richard can do little but wait for a rescue vehicle to finally arrive. It will eventually be a military helicopter. In the quiet situation of anxious waiting, somehow removed from the world, Susan tells her husband that she has to go to the toilet, but she can't get up. So he asks for a bowl and helps his wife to relieve herself. It seems somehow strange that the director gives this trivial scene so much space, and yet something crucial happens here. The helplessness in the face of this basic life activity reveals Susan's weakness and vulnerability even more than her being wounded by a bullet. In this descent into weakness, Susan is just herself, devoid of all representations, roles, and masks. In this nakedness of vulnerability, she is suddenly able to encounter her husband again, and he too can shed his protective disguises and be himself. In this moment, dividing language recedes into the background. Representations are gone, are ruined, and there are many representations mentioned in the plot throughout the film. The shooting of an American woman in an Islamic country must have a terrorist background. Arab villages must be dangerous, as it is the whole of Mexico, because it is full of Mexicans, as Amelia Nephew jokes. On the other hand, a Mexican nanny has no private life and is unconditionally at your service, while a deaf-mute teenager who is angered by her situation is perceived as a kind of monster, as Chieko herself realizes. A lot of wrong representations. All that, also the conviction that someone has to be guilty of the death of a baby, is far away in this intimate moment in the Berber hut, in which two persons beyond all representations are becoming capable of meeting each other as person, even though, or precisely because, they feel completely helpless. Susan and Richard have thus reached precisely the point that Girard describes as positive undifferentiation, in which we are capable of identifying with others beyond any acquisitive mimesis and rivalry. In Battling to the End, Girard says about this, quote, "This is Christian love, and it exists in our world. It is even very active, it saves many people, works in hospitals, and even operates in some forms of research. Without this love, the world would have exploded long ago," unquote. Benoit Chantre uses the term peaceful reciprocity at this point of the conversation, which he identifies with Girard's idea of good transcendence or real transcendence, which according to Girard presupposes the renouncing of autonomy, even the renouncing of the autonomy of desire. As Girard further explains, quote, St. Paul says, we should go to the next, okay. St. Paul says, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." This is the chain of positive undifferentiation, the chain of identity. We imitate Christ less than we identify with the one who, in the apocalyptic text, will have been Christ. To imitate Christ is to identify with the other, to efface oneself before him, unquote. This topos formulated in Girard's last book is already there in his first one. On the last pages of Deceit, Desire and the novel, Girard underlines the importance of the quotation from the Gospel of John in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. "If the seed does not die after it has been sown, it will remain alone, but if it dies, it will bear much fruit." The habit of this dying, of effacing, transforms deviated transcendence into vertical transcendence. According to Girard, death and resurrection in Dostoevsky's novel are not to be read solely in the sense of hope for an afterlife. Rather, it is about a descent into smallness, weakness, we may call it kenosis, that opens up hope for real transcendence of interpersonal encounter. At this point, Girard's thinking is perfectly in line with that of Emmanuel Levinas. At first glance, the two seem to use the concept of the other in very different ways. In Levinas, the other is the reality that compels the subject to break away from individual self-centeredness. To Girard, the other is first and foremost the mediator who either entangles the subject in the dynamics of mimetic desire, or which entangles the subject in dynamics of mimetic desire. But what for Levinas is the shift from intentional representation to a genuine vis-a-vis with the unique other, for Girard is the possibility of innermost mediation, of peaceful undifferentiation. In Levinas, the authority of the word of God becomes visible in the face of the least of these with whom the apocalyptic Christ identifies, exactly as Girard has put it in Battling to the End. Next. This transformation, according to Levinas, requires a transcending of language which is an expression of ideological intentionality and thus remains in the field of representation. The moment in which representation can be left behind, together with all the structures of pure justice and claimed authority, is when a person becomes visible in all their vulnerability. As Levinas puts it in Entrevue, I quote, "The face of the other, which despite all the spatial forms of expression in which the other already slipped into the skin of a personality plays a role, is pure expression, an extradition without defense or protection. The extreme directness of the opposite of, which in its nakedness is exposed to death. Nakedness, exposure, passivity, and pure vulnerability face as the mortality of the other person." Unquote. Susan radically proves to be mortal in a Moroccan hut, but she will survive, and we can hope for a new beginning to the relationship between her and Richard, as the movie shows us in the excellent way this revealing moment of the face of the vulnerable other. Of course, moments of vulnerability are not necessary turning points towards a positive end, as Babel also shows, but they are sensitive tipping points where there is an opportunity to break through the structures of sin. Concluding, I would like to take you to the final scene of the movie shortly. This scene takes place in a penthouse in Tokyo. Next. A Japanese police officer is looking for Chieko's father, but the teenager is alone at home. She thinks it is once again about her mother's suicide. When she finds out the real reason of the policeman's visit, she leaves the room briefly and then returns, stark naked. Once again, she tries in an awkward way, almost aggressive way, to find the closeness and recognition that she lacks in her loneliness. At this point, another act could be added to the tragedy of guilt. It would be easy to take up the girl's offer and sexually abuse her. The policeman does not. But he doesn't reject the young woman either. As the dentist earlier in the movie did. Confronted with the tears of the naked girl in front of him, he sheds the formal correctness of his office as well as any moral arrogance. He stays with her, becomes touchable, finds a third way between the obvious abuse and the rejection of her impossible advances. He perceives her woundedness, covers her nakedness with his jacket, holds her hand and wipes away her tears. This scene culminates what, according to Thomas Riegler, is the structuring theme of Arriaga's screenplays. I quote him again, central conflict or alienation versus coming together. Only one. Salvation or disaster, the decision is made in one small moment. Nudity and vulnerability, in a very real sense, becomes here the gateway to the perception of a personal humanity. Next. Yes, just as the weakness of his wife enables Richard to admit her own weakness and fear, his own weakness and fear, which he had previously hidden behind distance and accusation, Chieko's nakedness enables the policeman to shed the distance of his office, to expose himself and makes himself vulnerable. This is little he can do, but by holding Chieko and keeping her as she is beyond all representations, the hopeful final shot of the movie becomes possible. In this shot, Chieko is standing hand in hand with her father on the balcony of the apartment, with her father, whom she first time is able to face without blaming him for her mother's death. They are staying on the top of a skyscraper in Tokyo, a Babylonian tower in the tangle of lights of a global megacity. The camera zooms out, the two people become smaller and smaller and finally invisible. But we are aware of a moment of grace and hope amidst the ruins of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willi. Are there questions from the audience? If you still have to think about questions, then I can start with one. Just at the end, because you mentioned these two scenes with nakedness. And it seems the nakedness stands here for shedding the masks behind which we hide. But of course, because you mentioned earlier on original sin, in Genesis 3, the nakedness stands for not being good enough for each other, and being, in a sense, is a sign of having transgressed. Do you think that is a conscious inversion in the movie, or is there a link, or how would you see that?
Yeah, I think there could be a link, and it came to my mind when we heard the presentation an hour again or so about shame. And I think there are two different aspects of shame here in this film. The couple in the hut, there is no shame between them. There is no distance, a distance that could be necessary to keep sometimes. But the aim should be the nearness and the encounter. And in the scene with Jaco and the policeman, there is no shame. The girl is shameless. But then when the policeman says, "What you're doing, you're just a girl, stop that," then she covers herself and you have a moment of shame. And it came to my mind that it could be interpreted in this film that a closeness which should be produced by violence or by force causes shame. But when it's really there, when there is real encounter, there is no shame, like it was in the Garden of Eden before sin. So I don't know if this is an answer, but could be an approach.
Any other questions? Wolfgang, please.
Short comment. I haven't seen the movie, but your brilliant lecture made me wishing to see it soon. Very interesting. What I very much liked, in some way, you said just the opposite of the speech that we had before in the plenary session, because you showed that especially in the battling to the end, there is no addiction of Girard to an object. And just what you showed in the parallel between Levinas and Girard with the help of this film and these encounters, I mean, it's not a contradiction of the lecture, but a contradiction of the caricature of Girard that was presented in the lecture. I agree with the final, with his solution, but his solution was presented over against the caricature of Girard.
Want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think it was not so much a question, but a comment, and I agree with that. I think within the mimetic triangle, there are objects, but not when you overcome that. And also the critique that always women are objects. I think that's only if there is a mimetic triangle, then people becoming objects. And what was said, if you desire your wife as an object, it's not your wife. That's beyond this mimetic situation.
Yeah, I'm just curious, so if language, and I don't know if I caught this quite right from what you were saying, but if language is part of the thing that creates rivalry, is that part of what you were saying? How is language used in the end of each of these? Because I haven't seen the film. How is language used or not used as part of a connection or the overcoming of rivalry?
So I've presented some screenshots here, and you've seen these intimate scenes where this bodily contact is in the center. And it's not that much erotic, but it's being close together to each other. And there is not a lot of language in these scenes. So, as I've said, language is completely in the background in these moments. It's not completely away, but it doesn't play a central role. And I think that's not by chance in this film that language doesn't play a huge role when we have this imagination of positive moments. And I think that's not that much typical to Hollywood films, but the both are Mexicans and not Americans.
I think you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how this question is going to come out because I'm not quite sure that I quite have thought it through yet, but I'll give it a shot. How about that? You made the connection between positive undifferentiation and Christian love, which I found interesting and compelling. But the two examples we have here of moments of grace, it felt like there was perhaps a power dynamic or something else that created a lack of undifferentiation. Man, woman, wounded, healthy, police officer, teenager. So I just wondered if those power dynamics at all created a different type of positive undifferentiation in this case, or if Christian love somehow looks different. So I'm not sure that makes sense, but that was something I noticed when you were talking.
So that's not easy to answer if I grasp it correctly. You're right, there is a lot of difference in these scenes, particularly in the last scene, the young girl and the police officer. But I think what the film shows is that also this difference become less important. I mean, it's a situation in a Japanese society, and as I've learned in Japanese society, hierarchies are very important, and no people are at the same level, and it's always important to know who's above and below you, and so on. And particularly, a young, engaged police officer will be very attentive to act according to this hierarchy. But in this scene, he leaves that behind. I mean, it's quite dangerous for him to stay, not to go. It could ruin his career, and so he's going on the same level, I would say, with this naked, helpless girl. And that's a kind of undifferentiation. And also between the couple, they are accusing each other. So there is the difference between guilty and non-guilty, strong and weak, and so on. And in this scene, of course, Susan is wounded and the man tries to help her. But we have the imagination. They are both in the same way helpless. Also a kind of undifferentiation. So it's not 100%, I would say, what we can find in Girard, but there are a lot of traces that brings it close to them.
I add one more comment that your previous response elicited about the language and the body. Put that way, it reminds me of Karl Rahner's theology of the real symbol. The body being the real symbol of the soul, and really expressing what happens in the soul. And of course, he uses facial expressions as an example. Our facial expressions somehow show what's going on within us. And of course, he does that in the context of sacramental theology. So it has to do with a not with a sacrament in the technical sense, but with the sacramentality that is there in the world, in a broad sense. Would you agree with that?
Oh yes, I think that fits very well. I mean, in the sacramental context, words are interpretations of what's going on. I think they are necessary there. So one could say we can't do it without words. But they're only interpretation of what's really going on, one could say. Yeah, I would say fits well.
So we have time for a last question, if there is one. If there is none, we thank Willy very much for his paper. And then we move on to the next presenter, who sits next to me, Brett McLaughlin. He is a Jesuit. He is right now engaged in a doctoral project at Boston College. His guide is Brian Robinette, and actually I myself am second guide. His doctoral project is called Reign Over Envy, the Kingdom of God's Subversion of Conflictual Desires. But today, and I don't know whether it has to do with his thesis, probably it will. Today, his theme is Ruins and Crisis, Consolation in Fragility in the New Testament. But now we need a new presentation of Brett McLaughlin, please.
Online is the paper.
Oh, use a paper? Oh, you don't have a presentation. Okay.
That's a paper. Okay. Therefore, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and constraints, for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul the Evangelist's journeys and personal struggles are well known by the Christian audience. He encounters rival proselytizers competing for converts and must carefully articulate the spirituality and ethics of a novel Christianity. Central to Paul's espoused theology is each Christian's identity in the crucified and resurrected Christ. God's power is manifested paradoxically in the suffering of the God-man, and death is impossibly overthrown. Central to this proclamation is the presence of human weakness and afflictions in the lives of Christians. In the second letter to Corinthians, Paul boldly declares how God's grace and power arrived in his own person at the acceptance of a thorn in the flesh. This paper will argue that Paul is announcing the burden of weakness as essential to the transmission of the gospel, thus bearing a public imitation of the crucified Christ. Paul initiates an exchange of boasting among the Corinthians, but evades discussion of his heavenly vision and focuses upon weakness instead. Weakness is the very manner of his ministry and format by which he delivers the Christian message. Even though he boasts of weakness, the evangelist is timid of speaking how God's power is arriving in him. Inherently, Paul delivers a paradoxical revelation on the workings of divine power and grace. Such a dynamic is no singular subjective moment for Paul alone, but persists with the theme of suffering and hardship in the second letter to Timothy. The second letter to the Corinthians carries two primary themes: the glory of God and the reputation of Paul himself. Repeatedly, Paul contrasts human wisdom and God's grace as Paul ranges from appeal to cajoling, warning, anguish, anger, love, and longing in his efforts to get across. Ralph P. Martin posits that the Corinthians would have expected a boast from one of their evangelizers, but Paul repeatedly boasts of God. Between his two major epistles to the Corinthian community, external agents Paul deems false apostles have undermined his authority. Paul responds by proving his apostolic authority in weakness. It is indeed a thorough autobiographical meditation, though peculiar as Paul propounds his own vulnerability and frailty. It is especially surprising since, as R.V.G. Tasker summarizes, the general impression of Paul that the reader obtains from his epistles, not least from 2 Corinthians and from Acts, is of a man with an exceptionally strong constitution and remarkable powers of human endurance. Close quote. Calvin J. Rotzel goes so far as to suppose Paul adopts the mantle of the fool, mocking the pretensions of his critics and adversaries. He writes, quote, "Thus Paul parodied the pretentious and grand claims of his critics, and boldly stated and simultaneously used his body as a weapon. He presented it as shamed, bloodied, imprisoned, shipwrecked, beaten, hungry, sleepless, and scarred as the imitation of Christ. He disrupts the typical forms of rhetorical brutality." Close quote. Although Paul has recounted how 14 years ago someone ascended to the heavens in verses 1 through 4. This is 2 Corinthians 12. He shifts the conversation and debunks the notion that mystical experiences verify apostleship. Paul employs irony in verse 5, that one might boast of such a vision, but weakness is most appropriate and his own criteria for apostleship. It is not a blunt attack on his opponents, but a roundabout manner of critique. Mark A. Seefried proposes that Paul wants his listeners only to associate what they see and hear from him, not mystical experiences. In verse 6a, he even implies, if he were to narrate such a mystical experience, quote, I would not be foolish, for I would be telling the truth, close quote, as if his opponents falsified their stories. Raving of mystical visions and ecstatic prayer are ruled out as qualifications for leadership. Jan Lambrecht supposes that Paul shifts attention away from boasting in merit or the flesh in favor of boasting in the Lord. He is not rejecting boasting altogether, since Paul himself spoke with pride of the growth of the church in Corinth. But he draws a line between boasting according to the flesh and boasting in the Lord. Elsewhere in Paul's letter to the Romans, so chapter 3, verse 28, he underscores how all are justified by faith, hence no boasting is appropriate. Lambrecht analyzes, quote, it would seem that Paul considers all boasting in a certain sense foolish and also dangerous. The fact that in chapter 12, verse 9, Paul will boast most gladly of his weaknesses probably does not mean that he sees this boasting as normal and free of danger, close quote. He does not engage in boasting as a first reaction or defined stance towards hardship. Boasting occurs for Paul in context of hardship only following reflection. In the wider Jewish and Hellenistic context, accounts of one's personal sufferings may establish the true prophet and philosopher. Corinthians stereotypically expected status among leaders. P.J. Grabe notes that Greek peristalsis catalogs of hardship and weakness separated authentic philosophers from false ones. Paul's litany of weakness establishes his authenticity. Moreover, Paul likely has in mind the struggles of the Jewish prophets. Lambrecht cites Scott B. Andrews that overcoming catalogs of hardship are publicized to ennoble oneself. But Paul suggests his continuing struggles. He subverts the archetype that leaders are those who vanquish challenges. He sets forth a pattern of leadership where affliction is born. Paul clearly designates an angel of Satan as an agent of God's purpose to inflict the thorn in verse 7. Satan has been portrayed as accomplishing God's task in the scriptures. So you can look to Job chapter 2, and that's cited in Paul Furnish. One should not shift the meaning to presume that Satan was behind the affliction. Martin reasons that if Paul sought to blame Satan, he would not have chosen was given to convey that. He cites Galatians 3, verse 21, Ephesians 3, verse 8, chapter 5, verse 19, 1 Timothy 4:14, that was given usually means God's favor. Lambrecht sees the tense as a divine passive, and the aorist indicates that the thorn arrives at a specific time. It symbolically reverses the effect of the heavenly transport in verse 2. This person is obviously not in the heavenly realm, but quite tormented. The phrase is not in the form of judgment and punishment, but to slap and buffet Paul. Satan is inflicting less than deadly abuse upon Paul, but it is clearly following God's design or initiative. So that Paul would not remain too elated or become arrogant, a clearly ungodly malady was given to him. Martin identifies that the only other site for become conceited or be elated is in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, when someone puffs himself up against God. The thorn forestalls any inclination Paul might have to egotism or autonomy from God. Rudolf Bultmann sees it as unmistakably chronic, quote, an expression of the anti-godly cosmos, which also threatens and entices the believer, close quote. The thorn should not be assumed as the common persecution of Christians. Thorn in the flesh is an intensely personal description. In salvation history, it might be compared to Philo's rendering of an angel wrestling with Jacob in Genesis 32, verse 25. Paul's thorn in the flesh was likely well known to the Corinthians. It would not sound ambiguous to their ears. Against the interpretation of an incapacitating illness, Furnish argues that Paul could never perform so much travels, ministry, and organization if it was somehow a withering condition. In the most recent issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, came out just a few weeks ago, Ben Witherington III looks to Galatians 6, verse 11, that Paul necessitated large letters and a scribe, such as in Romans chapter 16, verse 22. Following this, Witherington believes some sort of eye affliction regularly impeded Paul. Though countless scholars have opined and searched Paul's text for a lucid indication of this plight, several contemporary scholars acknowledge we simply have no access to the precise malaise Paul was experiencing. In verse 8, Paul thrice petitions God to remove the thorn, perhaps resembling threefold prayers elsewhere in the tradition. Bultmann helpfully observes that Paul shuns any stoic response to his plight. Epictetus acts quite differently to hardships. Commentators over the centuries have supposed Paul follows Jewish and Greek models here, but Keener suggests Paul may have just decided to pray 3 times. Some think it could resemble Jesus' prayer at Gethsemane in Mark 14, verses 32 to 41, in which the Father also declined to remove the looming suffering. Yet Lambrecht rebuffs this notion, as Paul would unlikely have written tris to refer to the Gethsemane scene. Significantly, this is the only instance in Paul's letter where he states that he prayed to Jesus. This is the sole moment in the entire Christian scriptures where parakalesa, to beg, is the action of prayer. Verse 8 obviously indicates Paul has fervently asked for divine relief from the thorn that has been sent. Paul acknowledges an explicit response. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness, that he seems content with. Jerome Murphy O'Connor describes, quote, the response he receives is couched in the form of a divine oracle. So this is chapter 12, verse 9. This does not mean that Paul was conscious of a heavenly voice speaking within his mind. The form simply emphasizes the importance which he attaches to the insight. Close quote. There is no pledge of relief from the Lord, but Paul receives an epiphany that God's grace operates through weakness. Christ himself is the exemplar of this, empowered as he was crucified. Paul then receives such power because he accepts the response and continues in his work with the thorn. Martin looks to the verb tenses in verse 8, the aorist for begged and the perfect tense for his reception of the answer. Thus, even though Paul stops praying for relief, he grips the answer from the Lord with the vitality and vibrancy in the present. In verses 9 and 10, Paul declares that he is content with weakness in clear alignment with the ministry and sufferings of Christ. Well content is a potent word in Greek, as it is end and summary of Epicurean thought, according to Philodemus of Gadara. Elsewhere in Romans 8, 38 through 39, Paul has expressed that nothing can separate a Christian from the love of Christ. Balcom depicts, quote, if he experienced the dying of Christ in his frailty and sufferings, he also found in every escape from death, every encouragement after anxiety and depression, every convert made in the midst of persecution, a participation in the resurrection of Christ, close quote. Resurrection joys allow him to persevere through the hardship. It is Paul's very participation in the experiences in the person of Christ that is the relief itself. Paul's prayer reveals that weakness is the very mode that his ministry is conducted. Murphy O'Connor explains, quote, he sees weakness as the concrete modality in which his ministry is lived out. In reality, to boast of his weakness is to express pride in the ministry entrusted to him, and it is his commitment to this ministry which gives him a claim to the power of Christ, close quote. Paul takes the experience and the symbolism of the cross onto his own self and proposes to his audience that the image of Christ and his gospel should be born through weakness. This is a sociological, not a psychological weakness. Paul does not have to pretend to humble himself before God, but he must accept that he is losing capabilities for the accomplishment of his mission and prestige. Importantly, this is not simply enduring adversaries and false apostles, but the manifestation of the power of God in his persisting afflictions. Significantly, Paul's argument does not overcome those Corinthians who still expect accomplishment or ranking among leaders, and moreover, Paul does not iterate the capacity of this power within him. Lambrecht analyzes that Paul here does not feel comfortable elaborating how Christ and God's power is galvanizing his mission. In addition, whereas contemporary audiences might recognize Paul's emphases here as typical theology from Paul, his contemporaries may dismiss human weakness as a feature of divine power. Any challenger or opponent to Paul could simply scorn weakness language as evasive. Wouldn't someone in God's favor be obviously empowered by him? Paul must strive to force through a novel paradigm. The argument does not somehow transform weakness into strength or equate all grace with power. The thorn or stake still remains evil. Paul never transforms the thorn in the flesh into something good. Lambrecht asserts that Paul's paradox leads to reflection, but does not name the hardship as salutary. Paul still has to rely on the strength of an inner self. One must avoid conflating grace and power as equivalent. Paul arrives at a place of contentment, but power is never something that he owns or holds. Power is a continual gift to him that could cease. Even with his profound level of Christic imitation, he remains entirely dependent. Alongside his own explication of his style of leadership, Paul here redefines God's power for the Corinthians. Joshua Heaven names it as power made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 13, verses 3 through 4, continues Paul's articulation of divine power. Quote, for indeed, he was crucified out of weakness, but he lives by the power of God. So also we are weak in him, but toward you we shall live with him by the power of God. Close quote. Citing Isaiah 57:15 and Psalm 113, verses 4 through 9, Seefried posits that Paul inverts the concept of royal temporal power, because the Most High God settles among the lowly, not palaces. Paul uses the language of Israel in the wilderness for the power of Christ to live in the midst of the encampment. What's more, unlike earthly power, God's power does not seek increase, but remains in the present, in those situations of human weakness. Those Christians experiencing weakness sit, as Alexander Brown puts it, in the time between the times when where the crucified lie before the resurrection. The paradox will only dissolve at the eschaton. Nor does this situation sit as exceptional to the person of Paul and the city of Corinth. as Paul extends his exhortation to embrace suffering in his follower in the second letter to Timothy. Though the pastoral epistles are contested authorship, Luke Timothy Johnson holds that 2 Timothy is, quote, remarkably Pauline throughout, but the extremely compressed, almost telegraphic form in which Paul's ideas are expressed. It is as though Paul could write in shorthand, knowing that his reader was utterly familiar with his perceptions, close quote. Aside from the stated recipient of Timothy, Francis Young believes the implied readers are a Christian community in which Paul's authority is significant and Timothy is an honored associate. I will examine the second chapter, verses 1 through 13. A primary exhortation of the second letter to Timothy is for his assistant to take your share of suffering. This emphasis is repeated in chapter 1, verse 8, and chapter 4, verse 5. It is the core accent of the epistle. Whereas in 2 Corinthians, Paul speaks of physical affliction, here Gregory S. McGee, wagers that Paul realistically echoes the trials of imprisonment in the first century. Quote, the degree of specificity and severity in the descriptions of Paul's pain and shame from imprisonment in 2 Timothy finds no parallel in the other supposed later reflections in Paul's ministry. The detailed description of Paul's prison environment with its physical and emotional effects reflects Paul's actual experience and is not an idealized memory of the situation, close quote. Paul likely bore actual chains, and his need for a cloak in chapter 4 indicates he faced cold in prison. Rather than martyrdom, Timothy is being encouraged that he must endure this shame and physical suffering that is incumbent with association with Christ. In chapter 1, verse 12, Paul declares that he accepts this suffering without shame when others would find shame. Paul then employs three examples, the soldier, the athlete, and the farmer, to fortify Timothy to embrace the suffering that is entailed in his path. These three are typical figures in Hellenistic moral instruction. Johnson explains, quote, the reason these were such pervasive and popular examples is that each represents the active, strenuous life, fitting in particular the Stoic Cynic understanding of the moral progress as a kind of struggle for self-mastery, close quote. In verse 10, Paul remarks, quote, I bear with everything for the sake of those who are chosen, close quote. Timothy is to endure on behalf of his community. Verse 12 signifies it is to be an ongoing endurance to the end of earthly life. Timothy must acknowledge the strength that comes from Jesus, referred to in verse 1. But more importantly than listening to Paul, Timothy must draw upon the faithfulness of Christ for his persistence in suffering. The final verse 13 of this section specifies that Christ's faithfulness does not waver, unlike our own with the vicissitudes of life. Paul eliminates the phrase also, present in the previous verses, to stress Christ's dissimilar superlative form of faith. He constructs a sharp point. One must share in Jesus' suffering and death to share in his future kingdom and life. Conclusion. Paul reshapes the conventional impressions of power and grace throughout the 2 Corinthian correspondence. Despite the fact that Paul has just referred to a mystical transport through the heavens, he utilizes irony in boasting of frailty against his ostentatious rivals. This is not an unreflective retort by Paul. He wants his audiences to focus upon his preaching and actions, not reports of ecstatic states or charismatic powers. True boasting should only be according to the Lord, not the flesh and merits. Compared to other Hellenistic lists of hardships and leadership, Paul is idiosyncratic in stressing that he carries continuing affliction, which he will be unable to overcome. The thorn in the flesh that Paul receives is most definitely evil, quite the opposite of the heavenly vision he has just recounted. Though he comes to peace with the malady, he is certainly not espousing Stoicism. In point of fact, this is the only situation in all of Paul's letters where he begs for relief and explicitly prays to Jesus. The divine answer matches the concentration of the prayer. Paul receives a response of tremendous importance that he keeps present in his mind. In the Greek, he is well content, a noteworthy posture for holiness. The core argument of 2 Timothy to endure one's share of suffering to participate in strength and the faithfulness of Christ demonstrates Paul does not argue hardship and weakness merely to see through his own situation. Imprisonment and social ostracism may prevail as steadily as physical ailments for Timothy or any Christian. It is not a preparation for death by martyrdom. The soldier, the farmer, and the athlete persist in difficult lives. Unlike them, Timothy must focus himself upon the staunch fidelity of Christ above his own. Paul champions weakness as the method by which his ministry is undertaken, with a firm association to the experience of Christ crucified. This is not a call for humility or a different stance before God. It is a weakness before society and the community. The thorn or stake remains permanently evil and present. Although Paul boasts and highlights his weakness, he does not boast or illustrate the divine power coursing through him. He never constructs an airtight argument, as his opponents can always cast aside him as being shifty. Though divine power streams through his work and ministry, it is never something Paul holds, but his gift that continues. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a very thorough look at St. Paul. Are there questions in the audience? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the paper. Do you observe an obvious preference to the public acknowledgement of the weakness, or is it simply the weakness being present that seems to be a channel of grace?
Well,
Wait.
thank you. He's certainly in a situation where he's answering other rivals that are boasting, and so in some ways he's presenting a resume, but his resume is flipping the paradigm and talking about weakness. I mean, it is an affliction the Corinthians would have known about, and it would have sounded quite odd to their ears because, as I mentioned at some points, like the normal way of Corinthians just talking to one another is they build up each other's status. And so for Paul to talk about weakness, that's not a paradigm that they're used to. And so he's giving them a whole different way to think about God and think about his own ministry and think about him as a minister compared to others. And he's saying that he's the authentic minister because he is speaking through his own weakness and hardship. So in some ways, it deflates the status of his rivals, the other evangelizers, but not in a way that Corinthians would understand. So he's using his own affliction, which they would have known. He's using the boasting that his rivals are doing for an entirely different way of understanding Christ crucified, and for people to try to bear this within themselves too.
Any more questions? Then I again have one myself. I mean, you did not make explicit in your talk the relation this has to mimetic theory, but it was, of course, there. Boasting is provoking rivalry. So I think it became clear that this is included in that. Now my question is boasting about a weakness really better? I mean, there is this joke that in a community, maybe in your Jesuit community, someone says, but I am the most humble of us all. And so it does. How does that help?
Yeah, is it somehow a backhanded compliment that he's receiving this grace? He seems to. I mean, the beginning of that chapter, he talks about his transport to the third heavens, and he doesn't refer to it as himself, but it was him that received this transport. So he's following up this mystical vision with talking about his own weakness. But I think by the fact that it was an angel of Satan that gave him the weakness, so it would be one thing if it was received directly by God, but for it to be such an evil and for him to talk about it as an evil, I think in some ways it's still deflating his own status, because this is not a charismatic power that he's talking about. It's a thorn which he acknowledges given by Satan, which he acknowledges as a definite evil, not a grace in itself. I think he tries to point to the crucified Christ, and he is imitating the crucified Christ, and he's asking other people to imitate the crucified Christ. Timothy, and of course Timothy's followers, and the entire Corinthian audience that he has.
Oh yeah, now there. Okay. Well, that's it.
Defer to you.
Wouldn't you think that Paul himself is struggling with this new paradigm? I mean, it seems sometimes he's a quite ambivalent person, so I'm not criticizing St. Paul, but he's very eager in doing what he's doing. He's striving for success in his mission and so on. And it reminds me a little bit on the reflections Raimund Schwager did on Ignatius of Loyola, who was maybe in the same conflict, and maybe that's a usual conflict for persons who are that missionary and gifted in doing these things.
It's a real physical suffering that no one would want to have, and it's also impeding his mission as being an evangelist. And so I think he would wish, and he prayed 3 times to shed it, and he would wish to be rid of it. I think that he somehow, which he won't acknowledge, he is seeing the grace and the fruitfulness of his ministry, as Ignatius of Loyola saw, and other Christian saints have seen. So he's seeing that fruitfulness, but he doesn't talk about it. And that's a real lacuna that we have to, unfortunately, we have to work with. Is that it's flowing through him sometime, but he wishes to be rid of it, and I think he had to be content with the answer that he received, and I think his spirituality was at the level that the answers that he received he began to be content with, even if he had to continue to suffer, which is the same spirituality of Gethsemane.
Thanks for the paper. How's what you're saying, I wonder, kind of square with just this notion of God as being omnipotent, and maybe that's just a sort of, maybe you're taking that on in the paper. What does it mean to have power? But in what sense is God powerful in light of what you're sharing?
So it's the paradox of the crucified Jesus and the crucified Christ, and Paul's bringing attention to this, that Christ's power operates through weakness and through his willingness to undergo crucifixion, and that's the mystery that we grapple with.
Maybe I can give one thought about that. Many years ago, actually, at a conference, I gave a paper called "Is God's Omnipotence Violent or Non-Violent?" I put the "non" in brackets. And there I argued that actually we have to find out what omnipotence really means by looking at the drama of Christ, not by a philosophical idea first. And of course, I don't mean to exclude philosophy from the discussion. I think it's very important already the limits that philosophy puts on strange ideas, that if you're omnipotent, you can do contradictory things or stuff like that. For that, we need philosophy. But then we still don't know, are we dealing with the benign Father of Jesus, or are we dealing with a violent God who sets through his will? And if we do that, then actually God's omnipotence is that he arrives at the end that he wants, even despite against human counteraction. And he doesn't limit our freedom to counteract him, but he still finds ways to come to his end. So just a thought about it. Other questions?
Yeah.
Okay, then, Brett, thank you very much. And we turn to our third and final speaker, Joseph Fitzpatrick.
I need to stay.
No, you say just next, as you really did, and he will forward it, because the stick doesn't work.
Oh.
Okay. Joseph Fitzpatrick, if I'm right, he is from Surrey in England, but he has lived in Tunisia, and that is, of course, linked to his topic today. He also studied theology and philosophy, and today he speaks about religious imagery and the Catholic Church in Tunisia.
In Evolution and Conversion, René Girard states that the oscillation between evolution and conversion is the movement which best represents Girard's idea of history, which proceeds not in a linear progressive fashion, but, as has recently been argued, as a spiral. Next, please.
But
after the Ottoman Empire, the Protectorate of Tunisia was formed in 1881 when the Treaty of Bardo was signed on the 12th of May. The first Bey was Mohammed III, and the first Prime Minister was Mohammed Hasnadar. The last Prime Minister of the French Protectorate was Taha Ben Ammar when Tunisia became an independent nation-state on the 20th of March 1956. Following the independence movement from 1952 to 1956, led by Habib Bourguiba, who became the first president of the Republic of Tunisia after the new French Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France came to power in June 1954, instituting a withdrawal policy from Tunisia to lessen the violent backlashes. René Girard, in I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, states that the cross and the satanic origin of the false religions and the powers are one and the same phenomenon, revealed in one case, concealed in the other. Next, please. The principal metaphor is triumph in the Roman sense, which is a reward that Rome bestowed on its victorious generals. Standing on his chariot, the victorious general made a solemn entrance into the city and received the acclamations of the crowd. On the establishment of the Protectorate in 1881, infrastructure programs were quickly set up to build roads, railways, ports, lighthouses, schools, hospitals, and so on. Cardinal Charles Lavigerie founded the White Fathers in 1888. The Société des Missionnaires d'Afrique, known most usually as the Père Blanc, because of the typical white Maghrebian dress they wore. Next, please. His political activity included candidacy for the National Assembly of France, from which he was defeated, and he founded and constructed Notre-Dame d'Afrique in Algiers in 1872, in which the inscription on the apse read, Notre-Dame d'Afrique, priez pour nous et pour les musulmans. Cardinal Lavigerie considered that the Muslim faith ought to be protected from proselytism, and that the object of the Roman Catholic Church was to administer to the colonists. Construction of the Cathedral of Saint Louis in Carthage, perched high on the hill overlooking the Bay of Tunis, and the ancient Roman ruins, including the Roman amphitheatre, the Roman villas, the Antonine baths, the Punic ports, and the modern palace of the President of Tunisia began in 1884 and was consecrated by the French Protectorate on the 15th of May, 1890. It is said that during early days of the 20th century, the children of the French and the Italians joined hand in hand with Muslim children in processing down the hill from the cathedral in Corpus Christi processions, adorned in floral garlands around their heads. The Cathedral of Saint-Louis was built by the King of France on top of the ancient temple of Eschmoun and was dedicated to Louis IX of France, who had been sold in the slave market in the Medina of Tunis and who died of the plague on the Carthage site. The Cathedral of Saint-Louis displayed the magnificence of the French Empire and became the primatial cathedral of all Africa until independence. After independence in 1956, the Cathedral of St. Louis was desacralized in 1964 and was taken over by the Tunisian government to be used for public events and concerts of Tunisian and classical music. The cathedral desacralized has gone through periods of decline and regrowth according to funding available at different times, and in 1993 the name was changed to Acropolium. During the early days of the Protectorate, churches were built in so many places, in villages, towns and cities throughout the country, in order to serve as the spiritual center of each community, according to the colonial function of each place, linked by rail and road connections, and serving the industrial, agricultural, fishing, and mining aims of the colonizers. And religious ceremonies were conducted mostly in French, Italian, and Maltese, according to the community needs, by religious orders from France, Italy, and Malta, but mostly by the White Fathers, missionaries of Africa, and the White Sisters, who also carried out an educational function for Catholics and Muslims. Next, please. El Kram is a town situated in the northern suburbs of Tunis, in the conurbation of La Goulette, and is named after the fig trees, orchard and vineyards on which were built sumptuous homes in beautiful streets winding through the fields of fruit. It became the home of many French and Italian settlers from Catholic bourgeois families, and the church was built in 1903 as a parish church of the Archdiocese of Tunis. The first chapel in El Kram was blessed by Abbé Leno in July 1894 and was a simple room rented for 230 francs a year from Monsieur Cubassol. The community of El Kram and neighboring Khaireddin were keen in 1917 to produce a marble altar for the church. Since El Kram housed a number of military families before independence, the convention signed in 1954 to provide for internal autonomy meant that the families began to leave, and the modus vivendi signed by the Tunisian government and the Vatican on the 10th of July 1964 led to the church being desacralized and being converted into the cultural center of El Kram with the disappearance of the Christian community. The parish of El Kram is now attached to the parish of La Goulette, where in the church of Saint Augustin and Saint Fidèle, religious services are still provided in English and French. The Maltese community also used this church, and Mass was said in Maltese, a Semitic language closely resembling Tunisian Arabic. The Italians of La Goulette also had Mass in this church, in Italian for the Italian community, which in 1911 numbered almost 90,000 in Tunisia, engaged in trading, agriculture, and industry. In fact, at the time of the beginning of the Protectorate, the Italian community was actually larger than the French community. Next, please. Redeif is situated in the southeast of Tunisia, in the governorate of Gafsa, close to the Algerian border, and is the terminus of the Metlawi-Redeif railway line. The railway line was constructed for the transportation of phosphates from the mines and runs through the scenic Selja gorges. The church was built to serve the mining community and was entered only by the French Catholic community working there. In 1997, a drama comedy film entitled Redeif 54 was screened in Redeif. Next, please. And tells the story of how in the changing times of 1954, the ethnologist François and the lawyer Ibrahim returned to Tunisia after their studies in Paris. The film is set in and around Redeif, and the church is displayed as a central feature of the small mining town. The storyline draws its inspiration from the novel by Mohammed Salah Jebri, published in 1968, entitled Une journée de Zomra, maybe a kind of interdivisuality between men of two cultures, essentially intertwined, both sharing cultural and educational formation and remaining very alive in the contemporary Tunisian intellectual world, acknowledging the pain and sharing of the transition from colonizer and colonized to full independence and nationhood. The dedication of the church is to St. Paul and was opened in 1912 and constructed in the architectural style of Gothic revival. Redeif is seemingly weighed down by the functionality of the place, and Redeif is remote. The church was ceded to the government of Tunisia in 1964 and is now out of use. However, it is a credit to the contemporary Tunisian intellectual world that the building is celebrated in its environmental context, and that this time of transition of power is so thoughtfully under the consideration of the current generation and its close attention to the movements of the players in the film around and about the town in relation to the edifice of the Catholic Church and the interactions between all characters. Next, please. Now, constructed way before the establishment of the Protectorate, the Catholic Church of St. Joseph was built in 1848 by the Maltese and Italian communities on the island of Jerba in the southeast of Tunisia, close to the Libyan border. Contemporary uncertainties are evidenced, for example, by an observing comment on Facebook, such as, "Why were the crosses removed from the towers?" But the island of Jerba is a popular tourist destination with luxury international tourist hotels and conference facilities of world class. The island of Jerba has, for example, recently, in August 2022, hosted the 8th Tokyo International Conference on African Development, which brought together heads of state and government from African countries, Japan, the United Nations, to engage in dialogue on issues related to economic growth, trade and investment, sustainable development, human security, and peace and stability in Africa. The island of Jerba enjoys a traditional lifestyle and a traditional way of life, which many visitors enjoy experiencing. Handicrafts, the fishing port, a traditional dress specific to the island, with straw hats over white veils through which a red band, and a history of trade and maritime visits from throughout the Mediterranean. The major international conference bringing together heads of state from all over the Francophone world, Le Sommet de la Francophonie, including President Macron of France and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was held in Djerba in 2022, and the religious diversity of the island was celebrated nationally and internationally with the slogan Il était une fois, a play on words combining once upon a time with there was once one faith, indicating the will of Tunisia to celebrate diversity and to recognize the Tunisian heritage of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The interior, next please. No, not next. The interior of El Riba synagogue on the island of Djerba. The annual pilgrimage still takes place every year, drawing pilgrims from all over the diaspora.
Thanks.
Yeah, next. No, well, I don't know. It's okay. All over the diaspora of the Tunisian Jews, most of whom in Israel or France, to the mosque, serving the community of Djerban Jews since the 6th century. The Church of Saint Joseph, is in the main town of Homtsouk, and after a period when in disuse, following independence, the church was restored as a Christian place of worship in 2005. The Cathedral of St. Vincent de Paul and Saint-Olive is a landmark of national pride and stands in the centre of Tunis opposite the French embassy in the centre of the city. It has in recent years been restored to a very high standard and was constructed between 1893 and 1897. The Zitouna Mosque, meaning the Mosque of the Olive, in the centre of the Medina of Tunis, was built over an early Christian chapel dedicated to Olivia of Palermo. The myth in medieval Islamic Tunisia is that retrieval of her relics would portend the dissolution of Islam. The overall geography of the city centre, then, is like a cross intersecting in the city centre, now with the statue of Ibn Khaldun in the garden, between the cathedral and the embassy, and the Zitouna Mosque in the north. And the bishop. Yes. Next, please. Next. Mes Ibn Khaldun in Worstelblad. The Anglican Church of St. George. Next, please. It consecrated in 1901, today a dynamic international church situated in Beb Swiqa on the edge of the Medina. Next, please. The Greek Orthodox Church in Rue de Rome, dedicated to St. George and inaugurated the 7th of January, 1901, to serve the Greek community on top of an ancient Christian cemetery. Next, please. Jews have fled because of persecution, whilst Christians have returned to the countries of the colonizers. Comfortable Christian communities are composed of foreign professionals, but they are also the poor Christians. In Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, René Girard tells us that religious phenomena are essentially characterized by the double transference. The aggressive transference followed by the reconciliatory transference. The reconciliatory transferences sacralize the victim and is the one most fragile, most easily lost, since to all evidence it does not occur until the mechanism has completely played itself out. We remain capable, in other words, of hating our victims. We are no longer capable, in other words, of hating our victims. We are no longer capable of worshipping them. Next, please. In the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a charcuterie under the British Embassy at Porte de France, the entrance to the Medina. Michael Kerwin, in Discovering Girard, tells us of the uniqueness of Christianity, according to Nietzsche. The charcuterie had a picture of the Queen on the wall behind the counter. During the periods of presidency of Habib Bourguiba and Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, next please, most shops, offices and other public buildings displayed portraits on the wall behind the desk or counter. The charcuterie is no longer in Tunis. Where is the comparison in the of Tunisian context? Where is the power? Kerwin cites Nietzsche. Through Christianity, the particular has become so important, so absolute, that one can no longer sacrifice. This does not simply mean human sacrifice. The outlawed human love desires the sacrifice to the best of the species. It is hard, it is full of willpower, because it requires human sacrifice. And this pseudo-humanity called Christianity wishes to bring it about that no one will be sacrificed. The current Prime Minister of Tunisia, Ahmed Hashemi, has a French mother, and his family were not supporters of Habib Bourguiba. Pope John Paul II, next please, and next please. Pope John Paul II made an apostolic visit to Tunisia in April 1996. Pope John Paul II called for peace and reconciliation of all forms of violence within each society, as well as between nations. Speaking at Carthage Airport on his arrival for a 10-hour visit to Tunisia at the invitation of President Ben Ali, the Pope also appealed for cooperation in the region, particularly among Mediterranean countries. Pope John Paul II visited the Cathedral of St. Vincent de Paul and St. Olive. Next, please. After Cardinal Lavigerie, there followed a long line of French bishops, until following Monsignor Michel Callas, Fouad Toual became the first bishop of Tunis from an Arab country. He is a Jordanian from the Catholic Latin Patriarchate and was prelate of Tunis from 1992 to 1995 and bishop of Tunis from 1995 to 2005. Next, please. After that, Elias Nimer Laham from Jordan became Bishop of Tunis from 2005 to 2010, and the first Archbishop of Tunis from 2010 to 2012, answering directly to Rome with governance of the whole country. Next, please. Archbishop Ilario Antoniazzi, an Italian who had been a priest in Jordan, became Archbishop of Tunis from 2013 to 2024 and was succeeded by a return to a French bishop, the current Archbishop Nicolas Lernoux. Next, please. The youngest North African Catholic bishop, born in 1975. Next, please. The document on human fraternity for world peace and living together was signed in Abu Dhabi by Pope Francis of the Catholic Church and Sheikh Ahmed Tayyib, Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. Next, please. President Kais Saied was sworn in as the President of the Republic of Tunisia on the 23rd of October 2019, in the presence of the Grand Imam of Tunis, the Grand Rabbin of Tunis, and Archbishop Ilario Antoniazzi. Next, please. Cardinal Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, sees that without the two-state solution, the continuation of war is inevitable. Next, please. According to Adnan Mokrani, the best response to violence is non-violence, beginning by not contributing to any escalation and not creating an atmosphere of hatred that could incite physical or verbal violence. The Muslim does not offend any religion or faith, even when he does not share its doctrinal contents. That's the end. Thank you.
For a journey through Tunisia, are there questions in the audience? No, I must say I'm also drained of questions by now. Then we thank you for your paper. We thank all three presenters, and I think we now have earned ourselves some kind of dinner. So have a nice evening and see you around these days. Thank you.